As promised, I interviewed Professor Dr. Alena Douhan. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. She visited Syria between the 30th of October to the 10th of November to assess the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures or the sanctions on the enjoyment of human rights in Syria. I asked her about the negative impact of these sanctions against ordinary people in Syria and also the vital sectors such as the health sector, the education, the agriculture, and the energy sector, etc. Also, I asked her about the legality of these sanctions. Are they legal under international law or not? Take a look. Professor Dr. Alena Douhan, you are the UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. You recently visited Syria from the 10th of October to the 10th, sorry, from the 30th of October to the 10th of November to assess the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures or the sanctions on the enjoyment of human rights in Syria. You actually met with 21 ministers, the Speaker of the People's Assembly, the Governor of the Central Bank, and representatives from the civil society, and you published an initial report after your visit. In your assessment, do you think the input of the officials that you have met in Syria were enough and honest to draw conclusions on the Syrian case? Did you actually observe that there was any attempt from the official side to manipulate or influence the outcome of your research to hide possible government negligence? Because in Syria nowadays, people understand that the sanctions are hurting them, but at the same time, they also criticize the government for its shortcomings and negligence for recovering the Syrian economy.
Well, the question you are asking is multifold, and I need to note that a part of it goes outside the mandate what I have. That's why I will start with explaining what was the purpose of the country visit and what is the methodology of the country visits of mandate holder. So the purpose of the country visit was to identify the impact of unilateral coercive measures on the human rights in Syria, as well as the impact of overcompliance on human rights in Syria, as well as to analyze whether the government is taking any action to mitigate the impact of unilateral sanctions, as well as to mitigate the impact of overcompliance. So I do not have a mandate to analyze the situation in the country as a whole. That's why every thematic mandate holder is limited to the mandate it has. So the methodology of the country visits includes a number of elements, including comprehensiveness, verification, impartiality, independent, confidentiality, as well as non-reprisals. That basically means that the visit is usually split around 50-50 to the meetings with the governmental officials and meetings with non-governmental officials of all sorts, including the civil society, including diplomatic actors, international actors, and receiving information from all sides. My purpose was to verify the facts, figures, as well as the impacts which they face in their work in Syria, or which they face when they deal with Syrians abroad, because that was also one of the tasks. I need to say that from my side, I received all information which I requested from the side of the government. So traditionally, for the governmental part, governmental meetings are organized by the government, and I sent a list of ministries I would like to meet, as well as the list of institutions, including, for example, the central bank, and requested to organize this part of meetings. What was done? So basically, I received all information I requested, but take into account that the final report will be presented to the Human Rights Council in September 2023. I requested both the governmental part and non-governmental part to share with me any additional information they are able to share before May 2023, so that I can update the information received and be more precise.
Fair enough. The United States has a long history of sanctioning Syria. As far as I remember, it's from the 70s, based on different allegations. However, the sanctions imposed after 2011 have arguably deteriorated the humanitarian situation in the country in a severe manner. In your observation, what are the sanctions imposed by the United States, the EU, and other state actors, I would say, that mainly target the livelihood of ordinary people in Syria?
Well, again, it's, let's say, very complicated to assess what is the impact of specific sanctions of every specific country. So take into account that sanctions imposed over Syria is very multifold. So there is a list of countries which impose sanctions, as well as the scope of sanctions, diverse from, for example, cutting off SWIFT and cutting off the possibility of any banking relations, up to freezing assets of individuals, of banks, up to prohibition to do any reconstruction work, as well as targeted sanctions. My purpose is to assess the impact of all sanctions imposed by all actors, plus the impact of over-compliance on human rights in Syria. So in my trip, my purpose was to analyze the overall impact on human rights, and that's what I could identify as concerned the impact on the right to health, right to food, access to electricity, access to drinking water, access to education. These are general elements, as well as I could identify, for example, the impact over the vulnerable groups of population. And here I speak about people suffering from specific diseases, I speak about children, I speak about women, because they are affected enormously, especially the women-led households. I speak about internally displaced persons and refugees, as well as street children, for example. And plus, I was identifying what is the impact on people who are specifically designated, and quite often we speak about the violations from the point of international law, because many people, for example, are designated ex officio. That in reality means that the whole sphere of economy these people are cheering, and I'm speaking about ministers, is affected because all third parties prefer not to cooperate with public institutions if, for example, the head of the institution is designated. So in reality, the problem is that even when it's said that, for example, sanctions are targeted and they are targeted a specific individual, or they are targeting only, as it was said in the Caesar Act, we are targeting only luxury reconstruction. In reality, the key point there is public sector. As soon as the minister is designated, the whole sector is designated. And when we speak about reconstruction, the key sector word is reconstruction. So basically today, unfortunately, even the huge humanitarian institutions, and I'm not only speaking about NGOs, I'm speaking about United Nations organization, face enormous problem trying to rebuild, for example, electricity sector, trying to rebuild water pumps to guarantee that regular people have access to clean water and sanitation, or have access to electricity. So the effect is very diverse, but what I could observe that all population is affected.
One of the key impacts of the sanctions, as you highlighted, is on the economic growth of the Syrian economy. If we go back to the years 2000 and 2010, the Syria's economic growth averaged more than 5% per year. Now, how much the sanctions, in your evaluation, slowed down the GDP in the country after 2011?
Well, again, the mandate which I have received from the Human Rights Council is mostly focusing on the impact of unilateral sanctions on human rights, not on the economy in general. But unfortunately, what I could observe, despite the fact that the figures, the GDP growth figures were positive before 2010, so they were approximately 5%, what is a very positive development. Since the moment when sanctions were imposed, they turned to be minus. So basically, the GDP is not growing. The GDP was reduced. And I could also observe that this reduction of GDP has increased after the Caesar Act has been adopted in 2019. From the practical point of view, take into account that my purpose was to assess the impact of sanctions on human rights. That basically means that in the face of growing inflation, the purchasing power of salaries of people became much lower. The subsidies provided by the government were lower because the revenue was lower, as well as the number of jobs is lower, taking into account that many spheres of industry has been affected by hostilities on the territory or by the impossibility to keep on regular business with third countries or third country partners. And naturally, as a result, it affected economic and social rights of people enormously.
You highlighted the impact of the unilateral coercive measures on both the energy sector and the water sector in Syria. But the people in Syria are also asking why the government isn't able to provide these basic necessities for the people. Is it only about the sanctions against the government or the government officials that is banning or stopping the Syrian government from providing these basic necessities? Or because also you also highlighted that some of these resources are outside the government held outside the government control in all cases?
Well, when we speak about the humanitarian situation in every country, we shall take into account that we can never say that that's only because of sanctions. Naturally, there is a number of elements which shall be taken into account. In the situation of Syria, one of the important elements were the military hostilities, which existed on the territory of a country for a long period of time, starting from 2011. And one of the starting problems was that a huge part of infrastructure, including the infrastructure in energy sector, like the refineries, like the electricity stations or water pumping stations, irrigation infrastructure, as well as water supply infrastructure, has been affected by military hostilities. So that's the first problem. Second problem is the access to fuel. And as for today, a huge part of fuel fields is outside of the control of the government. So basically, the government doesn't have access to this part of fuel, and that means that it can't deliver and use this fuel. And as a result, it has been reported that people face a very serious shortage of gas to cook, very serious shortage of fuel to heat the houses. Although in reality, another part of the problem is that many houses are also destroyed in the course of the hostilities. The third problem, we, in the situation of Syria, we are not speaking about situation when the functioning of all infrastructure was fine and started to deteriorate due to the sanctions only, for example, or due to the behavior of the government. We are speaking about the main infrastructure, which has been essentially and very substantially affected by the military hostilities in the country. However, when we speak about any infrastructure, we need to maintain infrastructure. That basically means that for the maintenance of infrastructure, you need to have qualified personnel. First of all, you need to have the possibility to buy new equipment and to procure new equipment, as well as to procure spare parts, as well as necessary reagents. And here, I'm observing an enormous effect of unilateral sanctions on the reconstruction or rebuilding of the already affected infrastructure, as well as maintenance of the existing infrastructure. Unfortunately, everything what has anything to do to reconstruction or rebuilding is prohibited to be imported to Syria. I have met both governmental officials as well as many civil society actors and many international non-governmental organizations as well as many international institutions. And unfortunately, they all speak in the same voice. It's possible to deliver something what can be called like the emergency assistance, like food or medicine, but it's nearly impossible to deliver anything which will be qualified as reconstruction or rebuilding. So sometimes they manage to deliver tiny pieces for supporting of water pumps, for example, to bring a small generator to keep the existing water pump to function, calling it maintenance rather than reconstruction or rebuilding. In some places, it was possible to rebuild tiny pieces of irrigation system to allow for the possibility of agriculture, but still there are serious problems because the water for irrigation and sewage are mixed. That is reported to be one of the grounds for current cholera crisis in Syria. Mm-hmm. There are multiple reports, and these are not only the reports of the government. These are also reports from non-governmental organizations, from international organizations, that it's nearly impossible to deliver anything, to reconstruct water pumps, to maintain and reconstruct the electricity plants, as well as to rebuild necessary fuel and irrigation system. Moreover, to be able to deliver fuel to the remote areas, because there are lots of places are destroyed. Many people are internally displaced persons. They live in the temporary places. To deliver water, to deliver fuel, you need to use water trucks, or you need to use fuel machinery. And in a view of the serious shortage of fuel, it's a serious problem. Again, when we speak about the fuel, it has been reported that 2/3 of the fuel currently available in Syria is imported from Iran. And there are multiple reports that even this agreement concluded between Syria and Iran on delivery of the fuel is very much affected by unilateral sanctions. Several of the tankers, Iranian tankers, have been designated for delivering fuel to Syria. Moreover, a few tankers have been seized by other states, although released later on, but without fuel. So basically what I can observe, I can't say that sanctions have destroyed all infrastructure, because it's not true. But sanctions prevent maintenance and reconstruction of the infrastructure in the country, and prevent the possibility to restore electricity supply, water supply, access to fuel, access to gas.
Actually, I'm in touch with lots of people in Syria, and they're concerned about eating agricultural products nowadays because of the spread of the cholera, for example. And every day people can hear somebody from the neighbors or from the neighborhood is being infected. And we don't really know the numbers. You mentioned it could be possibly 20,000 people in Syria. Unfortunately, also in Syria, you don't have a mechanism to count these numbers. And some people have a cholera, they don't know. Some of them are, even if they are tested, it's not reported, right? But on the other hand, the health sector was affected by the sanctions, or the recovery, let's say, of the health sector is affected by the sanctions. However, the United States, the EU, and other actors say that their sanctions aren't targeting the health sector in a negative way. What do you say about that?
Well, I would say that unfortunately it's not the case. I could see a very clear impact of unilateral sanctions plus over-compliance with unilateral sanctions to the health sector in Syria. And unfortunately, the impact is very high. In accordance with WHO reports, the level of healthcare in Syria before 2010 was pretty high. It was considered to be one of the best in the region. Today, it's not the case. I will give you a few examples. So one of the first problems is that unfortunately today, due to the military hostilities, many health institutions have been destroyed, including many hospitals, and that means that equipment in these hospitals has also been destroyed. Lots of doctors or nurses have been killed or have migrated. So the country is facing very serious challenges as concerns the access to necessary equipment and access to necessary medical treatment. So many hospitals are moved to inappropriate for hospitals building. For example, they used a regular clinic for a traditional hospital, and there is a challenge to use for it, for example, for intensive therapy, or to use it for surgeries. Some of the impact on the functioning of clinics have nothing to do with the health sector directly, but it's a consequence of other problems, like, for example, the shortage of electricity. So when we speak about the shortage of electricity, in accordance to the statistics, the huge part of the territory has access to electricity per 2 hours or 4 hours per day. Hospitals are prioritized in getting access to electricity, but even for hospitals, the access to electricity is guaranteed for 10 to 12 hours per day. That's not sufficient, for example, to store the medicine in the cold storage or, for example, to store the vaccination. That's why, for example, there are multiple reports about the outbreak of diseases which didn't exist before because of the vaccination. And there are outbreaks of tuberculosis, of polio, of measles, as well as other diseases. As a result, due to the impossibility to store and to have access to this medicine from one side, and secondly, due to the huge number of internally displaced persons and street children, which are not all of which are registered, the level of vaccination dropped enormously. So under the statistics which I have seen, currently it's around 68-65%. So it's much lower than it used to be before 2011. Second problem is the access to the necessary medical equipment. One of the problems is to get to the hospital. In the face of the shortage of fuel, in the face of the problems with transport infrastructure, for example, railway infrastructure is affected around 80% due to the military hostilities. There is no possibility to buy new spare parts or to buy new buses, to travel by buses. So quite often it's a challenge to people to get to the hospital. The third problem is that the number of hospitals is lower now because the number of doctors is lower. If people get to the hospitals, it appears that there are problems to get the necessary testing, to get the final diagnosis, or to get a necessary medical treatment. Formally, medical equipment and medicine are exempted from unilateral sanctions. Unfortunately, in practice, it's not like that. Due to the fact that there are multiple threats to all institutions dealing with any sorts of products, including the produce and the medical equipment, if they get payment from Syria, due to the fear of banks to have anything to do with Syrian banks or anything to do with things, goods directed to Syria, there is no possibility to pay, so to buy goods. So first problem is to pay. Second problem is that producing companies reject to sell anything what is directed to Syria. So basically, quite often I have received reports from a number of civil society actors which say that we are lying. We are saying that these goods or this equipment is directed to Lebanon or is directed to Jordan, and we buy it then, and then we try to deliver it to Syria. There are multiple reports, for example, that spare parts for the equipment which is already in Syria, let's say, brought in the personal belongings by specific private actors or private individuals, just to restore the function. And I visited a few hospitals, and they said, oh, we have here a very old equipment. It didn't function for several years. However, we finally received a spare parts which has been brought by a private businessman in his personal belonging across the border. So unfortunately, due to the fear of companies, due to the fear of donors, and due to the fear of banks in the face of threats to have anything to do with Syria, there is a very serious shortage of spare parts and of equipment. I will give you an example. I was visiting an onco hospital, cancer hospital in rural Damascus. And one of the means to test cancer at the early stage is CT scanning. And when I asked what is the line for CT scanner for people who have been suspected to have cancer, the response was 6 months.
Wow.
And when we speak about cancer, it's necessary to identify it, so diagnose it at the early stage to be able to treat it. After 6 months, it's definitely not the early stage any longer. That means that the mortality rate for onco patients are much higher now than they used to be before 2011. Similar situation has been reported about other types of diagnostics. So several hospitals have shared with me the lists of medical equipment. Quite often medicine is not available. Many hospitals say, for example, that they have to request patients to come for example, to dialysis or to chemotherapy with their own catheter, because the hospital was not able to buy catheters or to request to buy catheters. A similar situation exists with medicine. Before 2010, Syria has a pretty developed system of pharmaceuticals production. And, however, as it usually happens around the world, the developed system of pharmaceutical production doesn't mean that the country produces all raw materials for production of these pharmaceuticals. That means that the pharmaceutical production depends on the maintenance of the equipment to produce pharmaceuticals, first of all, and there is a very serious challenges to get spare parts and to maintain the equipment, especially take into account that many producers reject to sell anything to Syria and moreover to provide post-sale services. That basically mean that it's not possible to do the regular maintenance and to fix it if something is broken. And secondly, there is a problem of raw materials. It has been reported that many companies reject to deliver necessary raw materials. So raw materials come from different countries now. Some of them come in the alternative ways. That's why it has been reported that the quality of raw materials is much lower. And naturally take into account that people try to pay attention to their health, especially in the urgent situation. It's reported that there are lots of medicine on the black market. Lots of them have been smuggled. And quite often the quality of this medicine is very far from being a good one. So basically I can say naturally, some medicine and some medical equipment is delivered, especially with the assistance of the United Nations. I have been reported that UNICEF is engaging actively. But unfortunately, what is delivered is very far from being enough to satisfy the need of people. And moreover, unfortunately, due to the shrinking revenue of people and shrinking incomes, many people are not able to get the treatment in private health sector as they used to have it before 2011. So they moved to public sector. That means that the burden over the public health sector is much higher now than they used to be before. And when we speak about the health sector, I also need to mention the issue of the professionals. It has been reported that due to the fact that salary in the public sector is enormously low now in comparison to the food basket. I will give the clear example. The average salary of the doctor, so the professional doctor in the hospital, is around $30 per month. And when we speak about the top-level professionals like the heads of hospitals, it's around $40 per month. And the food basket for a family of 4 persons, so only food, is around $100 per month minimal, so with all possible subsidies. That basically means that the higher level professionals in the health area, many of them migrated, or many of them looked for the possibility to work in the private sector or to change their job. That's why every hospital reported on the shortage of higher level professionals. In many hospitals, there are many very young doctors who have just graduated who do not have this experience. One of the most striking examples was when we were speaking about serious surgeries. It has been reported that for the most serious surgeries, there are only 2 higher qualified anesthesiologists for the whole country. That means that many people, even if you have the necessary equipment, are not able to get the surgery in time.
Actually, the other day I was reading data. Here in Germany, there are around between 5,000 to 7,000 medical doctors from Syria in Germany now itself, and most of them migrated from Syria after the war. And this is one of the also the problems, the drain of the brains from the country, that they have to leave who could live in Syria for $30 or $40. I can hear numbers from ordinary families that they are spending over $200 per month just for a basket of food. 100, as you mentioned, it could be a basic, but in practice, people are also paying way more than that to survive. Now, we addressed the unilateral sanctions on Syria and their possible impact, but the big question that remains, are these sanctions legal under international law, and what are your recommendations to the countries imposing these sanctions?
Well, from the point of international law, there are very serious problems with the use of unilateral sanctions. So theoretically, we need to take into account that countries always try to influence each other. But from the point of law, they can try to influence each other within the rules of international law. In accordance with international law, countries are entitled to impose sanctions when trying to implement resolutions of the UN Security Council acting under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. But that's not the case for Syria. There are no UN Security Council sanctions over Syria today. When we speak about the measures which can be taken by states unilateral, there are some measures which are unfriendly but still legal. For example, countries may decide that they do not like the behavior of each other and they decide to reduce the diplomatic presence in the country, or they may decide to stop diplomatic relations or not to conclude the international treaty they negotiated before. These measures are unfriendly, they impose certain level of pressure, but they are legal. So it's not unilateral coercive measures, they may be taken. There are some possibilities to impose measures which otherwise will violate international law in response to the previous violation. That's called countermeasures. These countermeasures can only be taken by the directly affected states, unless we speak about the situations of so-called peremptory norms of international law, like the situation of the aggression or situation of war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. In this case, any country around the world can take countermeasures. Countermeasures, however, cannot include the use of force, can't violate fundamental principles of international law. And fundamental principles are peremptory norms of international law, and they include, for example, the principle of peaceful settlement of international dispute, the principle of sovereign equality of states, the principle of non-intervention, and plus they cannot affect fundamental human rights. So basically, unfortunately, when we speak about the unilateral sanctions today, the majority of them, and I speak about around 99%, constitute unilateral coercive measures because they are illegal under international law. And when I speak about international law, I speak about the very broader context. I will give a few examples of the situation in Syria. When a country is announced to be a state-sponsored terrorism that undermines the principle of sovereign equality of states, that's a peremptory norm of international law. If the assets of central bank as well as of public institutions are frozen abroad, it's a clear violation of the customary norms of international law on judicial immunities of states and state property, because the property, for example, of the central bank is the property of a state to be used for the benefit of people. It shall never be frozen abroad. If we speak, for example, about the restrictions imposed over the diplomatic staff of a country, for example, they face problems in traveling across the host country, or they face problems in opening and keeping a bank account for their consular relations or functioning of the diplomatic mission, or they can't get insurance for diplomatic premises, it's a violation of diplomatic law. I can go ahead via, for example, trade law, against investment law, and many other elements, including the law of international treaties, because it's not possible under the law of international treaties to stop all international treaties. It doesn't work like that. Moreover, in accordance with international law, a huge list of international treaties, especially when we speak about multilateral treaties, shall not be suspended even in the case of military conflict, not even in the case when countries are not in the hostile relations with each other. That's why my main call, and which I tried to do since the moment when I was appointed as a mandate holder, that states shall first of all start acting in accordance with international law. Many problems will disappear if states will judge whether the measures they plan to take are in accordance with international law or not. Secondly, is to do any preliminary assessment of humanitarian impact of any measures which they are applying. And it's a normal behavior in international law. I will give you an example of the UN Security Council. UN Security Council is fully entitled to take sanctions against states as well as against individuals or companies. However, and it actively used it in 1990s and in early 2000s. However, around 2003-2004, the UN Security Council asked a number of non-governmental organizations together with OCHA to assess the impact of sanctions of the UN Security Council. And it has happened that the impact of sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council, which are legal, was enormous. And since then, the UN Security Council has changed its policy. That's why I believe that the second point is to do the precautionary assessment, so preliminary assessment of measures taken from the point of human rights impact, first of all, and secondly, to do the control of the humanitarian impact of these measures. And as a result of that, and I reflected it in my end of mission statement upon the visit to Syria, I call on states to lift and minimize unilateral sanctions currently imposed on Syria because of the enormous humanitarian impact and because many of them are violating international law. And for the very first step, I request to lift those sanctions which are affecting the critical infrastructure, because critical infrastructure is not only essential, it's vital for the survival of population.
As a Syrian, I just hope that the state actors would take a look in your findings, and especially the final report that is coming next year in September. And this could at least ease the unilateral coercive measures on the country. I have so many friends and relatives in Syria that I'm in direct touch with, and I can see the enormous, also they're suffering from the hostilities, as you mentioned, and later the sanctions are also worsening the situation. Professor Dr. Alena Douhan, you are the UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. Thank you so much for dedicating your valuable time and dedicating also an interview for Syriana Analysis. I'm sure the audience and the followers appreciate your insight and input for a very important topic that I addressed several times, and now you presented it from the UN perspective as well. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure for me. Thank you.